Hey y'all, it's Ashley Bookishrealm and I'm back with another video. So as y'all know, I have done quite a few different reaction videos on this channel to a lot of different lists and things that I think are pretty cool. So I wanted to do another reaction video today, and I was thinking, I was like, what is something like another list that I could react to? And with everything that I've been doing with my job related to like youth collections and stuff, I was like, I wonder if anybody's ever made a list of like the top YA novels of all time. So I found a list that was done by Cosmopolitan, which looked like it was one of the most recent. So this was done in April of 2021, and it is the top YA novels of all time, and then it's subtitled the 45 YA books every adult should read. So I didn't look through this list. Whenever I do this, I just do a general search, and then I think that this could possibly be a good list, or it could be something that might be fun to react to. Plus, I like to make sure that the list are kind of things that have been done at least within like the past year or so. So we're going to go ahead and I am going to react to this list. These are always fun and interesting because I usually have a lot of commentary to make about people's best books of all time list. And this should be fun since it is the best YA books of all time. So let's go ahead, jump in and get started. Okay, so this is the Cosmopolitan website. And like I said, it's kind of subtitled as the 45 YA books every adult should read. But as you can see, like at the top right here, it says best YA novels of all time. So this is really interesting. It's done by 3 people. This was done in April of this year. So it's pretty recent. And 3 titles already that I don't think, 2 of them I have heard do not hold up. Well, one with Rainbow Rowell, there are lots of issues there. Hunger Games is considered a YA classic at this point, and I have not read The Hate U Give since it came out. Whoops, I scrolled too far. I have not read that since it came out, so I don't know whether The Hate U Give holds up. I have heard that it does not hold up. So yes, I'm not going to go through all of this. Clearly, this is an introduction text. Okay, first book they have on this list, To Kill a Mockingbird. They say one of the best books of all time. I read To Kill a Mockingbird when I was in high school, and I had some thoughts about To Kill a Mockingbird. It's been such a long time since I've read To Kill a Mockingbird. I think that it has some themes that now in 2021 wouldn't necessarily hold up, but I think that it is an important classic for the time that it's been written. And ironically, this is not often sold or cataloged as teen or YA fiction in bookstores or libraries, so it's very fascinating that they included this one as part of the YA genre. Number 2, they have Little Women. I have not read Little Women, but I've heard wonderful things. I've read adaptations of Little Women, but I have not read the original text, which is awful. I do have a copy of the book, but everyone that has read Little Women has absolutely loved it. Great coming of age novel, as well as a great look at like sister family dynamics. So one day I will read that book. Let's see, number 3, Stargirl. I'm not surprised to see Stargirl on this list. I have not read Stargirl. I heard that it is extremely heartbreaking, but it is one of those YA classics that would probably end up on a lot of lists. Tweet Cute by Emma Lord had a lot of traction when it first came out a couple of years ago, maybe a year or 2 ago. Time is such a funny thing. It had a lot of traction when it first came out, and I think it was pretty popular on BookTube. It made its rounds on BookTube, but you know, I haven't really heard much about Tweet Cute since it came out, so that one is rather interesting to me. Grown. I mean, of course, one of the best books of all time. I'm going to be biased here because Grown was one of my favorite books of 2020. Tiffany D. Jackson is doing her thing in terms of writing mysteries and thrillers in the YA age categorization, and Grown is one of those that I think is going to stand the test of time. So yeah, this is definitely one. I'm glad that they included this one on the list, especially I was kind of worried about the direction that we were going in terms of what those first 4 titles were doing, but I think we'll be okay. Okay, so this is actually a decent list. Now, I personally have not read Don't Ask Me Where I'm From. I started it on audio, but I had to return it before I was able to finish it, and I've heard great things about Don't Ask Me Where I'm From. It hasn't really made a lot of rounds in the booktube community per se. I haven't seen a lot of people talk about this one, but in the library world I have heard a lot about this one, so this is great that they included it. And like I said, this is about a first generation American Latinx girl trying to find her way in a predominantly white space. So I think that it's always interesting looking at perspectives of other marginalized communities and what it's like for them to have to navigate predominantly white spaces. Like, I know what that's like as a black person, but I don't know what that's like, you know, being Latinx or being Asian, like, or any other marginalized group. I don't know what that experience is like, so I always like picking up books where we do get that perspective. Let's see, scrolling down, number 7, Bloom by Elizabeth Scott. This is an older one. I have not read Bloom. I have heard of Bloom, but it is, like I said, this one is an older one. This is blurred by Deb Coletti. That's how I know that it's an older title too. But I don't think I even have any interest really in reading this one, and I don't know much about it. I've heard of it, but don't know much about it. So I don't know whether it's really warranted to be on this list or not. If you've read it, let me know if you think it should be on a top list. Okay, Hoot by Carl Hyacin. See, it's interesting that they are kind of blurring the lines of what it means to be YA and what the age demographic is, because like for us, whenever we have Carl Hyacin books, Hoot, for example, is a huge popular book amongst a lot of our middle grade readers. As you can see, it's a Newbery Honor book, which means that it's targeted at children and not so much like a teen audience. So this is very interesting in what they're determining to be YA when I'm thinking about age, because I definitely would say that Hoot is middle grade and not a YA title. Very, very good book, but I just would never put it on this list if we're talking about age categorization of YA, which is typically going to be anywhere from like 13 to 18. Sometimes people do include 12 in that age group, but mostly you're going to see 12 to 18. A lot of books now are geared towards like 14 to 18 as well. All right, let's keep going. Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. Not one that I've read. I actually have not read any Alice Oseman, but I know that some people are huge fans, some people are not fans at all, and this is one that I have seen move quite a bit. I have not read it. I don't know if I necessarily have any interest in it, but I know that some people speak very, very highly of Radio Silence. And this one, A Mango Shaped Space by Wendy Mass. So this is another one that I'm interested in how they determined what their age groupings were, because Wendy Mass writes a lot of children's and middle grade as well, mostly on the children's end. I feel like A Mango Shaped Space is more of like upper middle grade. So here we are. This is an interesting list, and this is why I like reacting to stuff like this, because I'm curious as to what everyone's definition of YA is and what that age grouping would be. I think it varies library to library, bookstore to bookstore. Like, you know, clearly content creators of this list, it varies, which is which is interesting. I have not read that book though. One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus. You know, I think that Karen M. McManus should be on this list, but I would not have chosen that book to be on the list. I have read every single book that she has published, which has been 4. It's One of Us is Lying, One of Us is Next, The Cousins, and there's a 4th one that I cannot remember. It's about, I think, siblings. I cannot remember the name of that 4th book, but I've read all 4 of them. And honestly, One of Us is Next is the best out of the 4 of those books, which is the sequel to this book, One of Us is Lying. So I actually would have put that one on the list instead of this, but I get why they did it, because One of Us is Next is a sequel. But I do think that she is doing great things in terms of mystery and thriller and YA, which there's not a lot of people doing it very well. I mean, like, Tiffany D. Jackson definitely is a front runner. We have Ace of Spades now, which is definitely a great one. But as far as like people who are consistently working within that subgenre, I don't feel like there's a lot of people. But this one I'm surprised they didn't. Okay, they put The Breakfast Club. I was like, I'm surprised they didn't put The Breakfast Club on there as like what it's usually marketed as, because that's what it's marketed as. It's like The Breakfast Club, and there's these kids who are in detention, and one of the kids ends up dead, and you have to figure out like how this kid ended up dead when it's only 5 of them. And it does have that Breakfast Club vibe to it. But the sequel was so good. The sequel was good because literally the last 2 pages of the book had me blown, like completely blown. It was just that good. All right, let's keep going. Okay, I feel like any book that talks about like, or any list that talks about like coming of age or young adult, people feel the need to include The Catcher in the Rye. And they said it here. We know you've heard of this one before, but this list probably wouldn't be complete without it. Every time you're going to come across a list that's like YA oriented, coming of age, we're talking about youth and development, The Catcher in the Rye usually is on the list. I mean, I'm not a fan of it. It's one of those classics that I think a lot of us are forced to read too young. I think there's a lot of classics that we should be exposed to at such a young age, because I think that it deters a lot of kids from reading, because it's hard for a lot of kids to connect to those experiences, and it just, reading levels kind of play a role in that too. Jason Reynolds made a really good point when I heard him speak last year. Once again, time is a funny thing, but when I heard Jason Reynolds speak last year, he was talking about the fact that this is how you push kids away from reading. Like when he was in school, like he hated it because they had him reading books like Moby Dick. Like, what enjoyment is he going to get out of Moby Dick? What connections is he going to make to Moby? He's not, because 9 times out of 10, where he was from, the kids that were in his neighborhood were never ever going to know what it was like to be on a boat. So while these things are classics and they have their place in literature, I don't always feel like they have their place in every single classroom, because they're not there yet. I don't think kids, and it's not that every kid isn't there. There are kids who are able to read The Catcher in the Rye and they get it and they enjoy it, but a lot of kids, they don't, and they hate it. They're not going to connect to it. They end up hating reading because of having to read stuff like that. So that's how I always have felt about The Catcher in the Rye. Angus Thongs and Full Frontal Snogging by Louise Renninson. I've never read the series. The series was a big thing on BookTube years and years ago. I know that a couple of people have reread them and they don't necessarily hold up, but they have a sense of nostalgia to them. I did not know, it says here that it was ranked number 35 on the most banned and challenged books from 2002. I should have known that because I actually reacted to that list, so I don't remember it being on that list, but I have a reaction video to that list. Next, Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli. I read this, I think for the most part I enjoyed it. I did like the movie Love, Simon. I really enjoyed Love, Simon, but I feel like a lot of Own Voices reviewers like hate this book. So I don't know what that necessarily says. It's been years since I've read Simon, and you know, I don't know if it's something that I'm really interested in going back and reading, but it did make a huge impression on the age categorization of YA as a whole. National Book Award long list. It definitely has made its impact, and I know that Becky Albertalli has done a lot within this like Simon universe, but I've never read past this first book, but I can understand why that was included. Prep, honestly, I've never heard of this book before. It looks older. It's an author that I'm not as familiar with. It's about a teenage girl as she goes through high school at a fancy New England prep school. Not something that I probably would be interested in reading now or ever. Like, I wouldn't. Okay, of course, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This is one that I think should be included on this list. Should be. I don't know what just came out of my mouth, but what I meant is I think this is one that should be included on this list. And it's complicated because, like I said, I know that this one has some issues associated with it, meaning that there's some aspects from what I've heard of this book that do not hold up. Now, I have not reread this book, like I said, since it was published in 2017, and I read it right when it came out, and I have not reread it since then. So this is one that I do want to go back and revisit because I want to see if it holds up, and it may not, but it has made such a powerful impact on YA that, yeah, you know, I would have to definitely include it on the list. The Outsiders is another one. Regardless, S.E. Hinton has made some really strange and obscene comments about graphic novels and how it doesn't really count as reading, which is totally offensive as a librarian. That was like one of the most offensive things that she could have ever said. But this is considered to be like one of the first like YA books. I mean, there were YA books before this, but this is one of those books that like really kick-started YA. And I mean, like, this came out in 1967, and it's withstood the test of time. I know a lot of people don't necessarily like it, but yeah. All right, Homecoming, if I could speak, by Cynthia Voigt. Another one that, you know, these, and it's not that these titles shouldn't be included on this list. I think it just depends upon how you view the age categorization of YA, because some of these kind of, like I said, they tilt between high middle grade, like upper middle grade, to low end YA. So it all depends. I have heard a lot about Cynthia Voigt work within her materials all the time, being in the library, but I have never read a Cynthia Voigt book to my knowledge. The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, I definitely could see this one being on this list. It definitely is a book, I mean, that listen, it is a book that still heavily circulates, if that tells you anything. And it's one that people still want to read. It's one that I am still trying to work up to reading because of the things that I have heard and how heartbreaking it is. But I've read some of Marcus Zusak stuff before outside of The Book Thief. The Book Thief is one of his books that I have not read, and I need to get to it, but definitely can see why that one's on the list. Lord of the Flies. Listen, no, and no. Lord of the Flies, hate this book. I think it is very influential on the age categorization of YA. If you think The Hunger Games, The Hunger Games essentially is Lord of the Flies. However, no, I would have kept that off the list. And then right after you put The Hunger Games, because the two are very closely tied together in terms of like themes that they have going on. And as much as I may not like the Hunger Games books, which is crazy, it's one of those things where I like the I like the movies, but I don't like the books. It's one of the only book series where that's happened for me. I do consider it to be a YA classic. Hunger Games definitely is a YA classic, and it holds its place within YA, regardless of whether you like it or not. It is considered a classic. Of course, Judy Blume, Forever, has to be on this list. Forever is iconic when we talk about young adult literature. Forever is a book that I talked about or had to learn about whenever I took my young adult literature class when I was getting my master's in library information science. And you know, it is very interesting because, like I said, this book came out in 75, and it talks about a lot of things that would have been considered controversial for its time, or things that would be considered, like they say here, taboo, which are not taboo. It's just things that probably should have been in young adult books at that time that were not present, because it was like, we don't talk about that stuff. This is not stuff that we talk about. So if you've never read Forever by Judy Blume, I beg of you, read it. Read it. Sweet Valley High, definitely. You know, listen, let me tell you something. Cosmopolitan is not doing a bad job with this list. This is not a bad list. This is a pretty solid list. Sweet Valley High. I mean, would I read them right now? Probably not. I mean, they're not the first thing that I would want to pick up. But do I acknowledge that they are very, very important to YA? Absolutely. Absolutely. 181 books over a 20-year period. Super important series. Things that I think people would still love. 24 fangirl. Could do without. I'm not a fangirl fan. I mean, I liked it when I read it, but that was years ago. But I didn't like the actual like fandom parts of it, where we got the fan fiction. I didn't like that. So I like the story, but not the fan fiction parts. And the fan fiction now are actually books. And then we have all these issues with Rainbow Rowell now. So it just, you know, I wouldn't necessarily include it, but that's me. This list would not be a list without Speak. Speak, yes, by Lori Halse Anderson. Such iconic book. Oh my goodness gracious. If you've never read Speak, I need you to pick it up. It deals heavily with a character that is trying to navigate sexual assault, and it is powerful. Such a powerful book. And I had the honor of hearing Lori Halse Anderson and her daughter speak a few years back, and she signed my copy of Speak. Oh, she's great. She's great. Absolutely great. The Fault in Our Stars. Now, everybody, you know, everybody loved John Green at one point, years and years and years ago. And it's not that people don't like John Green, but I think that John Green wrote his characters as teens, but it wasn't realistic. They were super mature for their age. I mean, beyond their age, to the point where it's almost unnatural that they were that mature for their age. But, you know, I read The Fault in Our Stars. I've read a few of John Green's books, and they are what they are in terms of where YA has been and where it's going, and he has laid a lot of groundwork in YA, so I won't deny him that at all. The next one, How I Live Now by Meg Rossoff. I've never heard of this one. This was published in 2004. And it's, oh wow, this sounds interesting though, because this kid's being sent away during a war, and it's World War III. That's crazy. Okay, Knots and Crosses by Mallory Blackman. I have not read Knots and Crosses, but it definitely is a timely book. It is held up. People still read Knots and Crosses. People still pull a lot of interesting conversations from Knots and Crosses, and it's one that I do want to get to. I did not know that it had been published in 2001. I thought it was published later than that. That's extremely interesting. The Perks of Being a Wallflower. Yeah. definitely. Still have not read that book by Steven Chbosky, but I definitely want to read it. I've seen the movie and loved it. All the Right Places by Jennifer Niven. Now this one's interesting. I think this one was popular when it came out and it eventually lost its steam, but I think that this one, if I'm thinking correctly, I could be wrong in my assumption of this, I feel like this one was probably added because of the mental health representation, which has had to kind of grow in YA. It's had to develop and it's had to become better in terms of representation. So I think that that is important, and it's one of those ones where endings, not always pleasant. And let's keep going here and see what we have. Princess Diaries. I would definitely include this on this list. Very, very, I don't like the book version of Mia. Like, I think that they did a good job translating Mia from these books to the Princess Diary movies, which, thank you, Miss Houston. Whitney Houston was an executive producer behind that, if you did not know that. Fun fact for the day. But I think that the Princess Diaries do hold a strong place within YA contemporary romance. Mia, to my, in my opinion, not the most likable character, but still an important series. To All the Boys I Loved Before, I think that this is important, not just because of what traction it's gained in terms of like these Netflix adaptations, but seeing positive representation of Asian characters in a contemporary romance setting. And Jenny Han definitely brought that to the forefront and laid a lot of groundwork. Not saying that it hadn't happened before her, but I think that her doing this was so successful that when she was able to do it and it was getting adapted to Netflix, now you have so many other people who are now being able to break through in publishing and get stuff adapted and stuff like that. So, or adapted. I'm just making up words. Clearly I'm exhausted here. Chronicles of Narnia. Okay. Yeah, so once again, this is one of those things where, like, we catalog Chronicles of Narnia as children's, but if we're talking about a lot of crossover ability here, Chronicles of Narnia is there. A lot of people don't necessarily enjoy it. It's heavy Christian themes in the Chronicles of Narnia, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. It's been years since I've read them and I never finished all 7 books. Tuck Everlasting. Never read Tuck Everlasting. Seen the movie. I see Tuck Everlasting on a lot of lists when it comes to talking about YA lit. I haven't read it. I don't know how I keep saying iconic. I don't know how powerful of a text this is to include it on the list, so I can't say yes or no either way. Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. Yes. Okay, so one thing that I wish that they did is that they're pulling a lot of older titles, which is good. I think that what you're seeing here, and you're probably like, there's not a lot of diversity. It's not. If we're looking at books that have shaped YA and books that will continue to shape YA, you're not going to get a lot of diversity because the whole movement of really having diverse titles, especially own voices, even though they're no longer using that term own voices for a lot of different reasons, you're not gonna get you're not gonna get a lot of diversity because it wasn't happening back then. You are getting kind of, your typical white author, white characters, a lot of cis hetero characters, and it is what it is, unfortunately. But it's one of those things too, when you're looking at the history of YA, you acknowledge what has been there and what has shaped it, and then you continue to change what it has been. So like including titles like To All the Boys I Loved Before, including Grown, like that showing where YA I think is heading. But titles like The Sisterhood of the Traveling traveling pants shows where YA has been, and whether this series holds up now, which I think in some parts it doesn't. I was doing a reread it once, but that was years ago. I feel like if I read it in 2021, I don't know if it would necessarily hold up, but it's one of those contemporary series that was super important. So yes, I'm super happy that they included Alana the First adventure. This year was my first time reading the Lion Quartet. Was it Lioness Quartet? Yes, that's the name of the series. This is my first time reading the Lioness Quartet series, and the first book is Alana the First adventure. Very important. If we're talking about YA fantasy, very important. Although these do have some crossover appeal as well, where they can sit in children's or middle grade, and YA at the same time. But yeah, those were way ahead of their time. Published in the 80s and really were making some interesting strides to be published in the not even late 80s. We're talking early 80s. I think the first one was published in like anywhere in between 82 to 84. The Giver by Lois Lowry. Yes. Definitely. I have not read it, but it is very important to YA. Once again, here's these things that I don't like about these lists. Stop repeating authors. There's no need to include an author 2 times on a list like this when there's space to include other people. This could have been a spot for someone else. We know that John Green has made his place in YA contemporary. There's no need to include Paper Towns, which Paper Towns, I can't remember if that's one of my least favorite of John Green's or not. I can't remember what I rated Paper Towns. But I've read like Paper Towns, I've read Looking for Alaska, The Fault in Our Stars, and then I don't think I read An Abundance. Maybe I did read An Abundance of Catherine's as well. And then I also read the one, what was the double name book? I can't remember that, but I've read most of John Green's stuff, if not all of it, to be honest with you. Diary of a Young Girl. I think this is good inclusion of nonfiction. A lot of times, and this is everywhere, this is including in libraries and bookstores, YA nonfiction does not get a lot of traction at all. It's not something that a lot of people necessarily read. It's not a lot of stuff that's necessarily written because I don't know, it seems like there's nonfiction for like children in middle grade and adults, and then YA just can't seem to find the right balance for nonfiction. So I'm glad that Diary of a Young Girl was included on this list, which I did have to read when I was in school. 5 Feet Apart, I think also one of those that got traction when it first came out, and 2 characters suffering from cystic fibrosis. I don't know how well this one was written, and I don't know how well this one was received, so I don't know if I would include on the list, but that's because I don't really have any strong knowledge of it. The Princess Bride by William Goldman. So I watched The Princess Bride for the first time with my patrons about a month or 2 ago, and it was hilarious. So I do think, once again, we're talking here in terms of like classic YA fantasy, kind of shaping the age group, and you know, pulling from what would consider to be considered mostly children's fantasy and adult fantasy, like closing that gap, filling in those places. Percy Jackson, middle grade, but it does have crossover appeal. So, you know, I keep going back to this, but I really would like to know, like, what did they determine their age bracket to be in looking at this? Because Percy Jackson definitely middle grade, but I mean, I know a lot of teens who enjoy Percy Jackson as well, adults. I mean, I think this community loves Percy Jackson. It definitely has appeal. Bright Lights, Big City. I have never heard of that one, and apparently it was published in the 1980s. Nicholas Sparks, A Walk to Remember. I would not put that on a list for YA. I mean, it could just be my beef with Nicholas Sparks in general, but I would not put this as like a YA book, like, of all time. Not Nicholas Sparks would be nowhere. And as much as I hate Twilight and Stephenie Meyer, as you all know from the live shows that I did with Bethany, Isabella, Izzy, last summer, we read all of the Twilight books and Midnight Sun, hated them all, hated my reread of them all. They are the start of that golden age. It's literally called the golden age of YA. Twilight is a part of that, unfortunately, but it further shaped YA. It is very, very important to the history of YA. I don't agree with what she has done in those books, how she has treated a lot of different groups, especially the Quiet Tribe. I don't agree with any of that, but it is important to acknowledge it as a part of YA book lists. So yes. All right, y'all, so those are apparently the best YA novels of all time. These are 48 YA books that they feel like adults should read, that every adult should read, because they're the 45 of all time. This list it did pull some very like big historical pieces. I will say that there are a lot of historical, and I'm not saying like historical fiction, but I'm talking about like the history of YA. There are a lot of books on there that are important to the history of YA. I think when they started pulling more modern titles, there could have been a little bit more diversity in the modern titles that they chose. I think that they could have leaned a little bit heavier on modern titles. I understand the lack of diversity in the older titles because it just is what it is. That's how it was. But if you're looking for a balanced list, I always say, 50% of that could have been like backlist old titles. I mean, these all probably would have been backlist, but when I say like, books historically that are important to YA, and then half of the list should have been like books that are currently shaping YA to what it's going to look like in the future, because there's an opportunity for a lot of YA books that have been published within the last 2 to 3 years that are doing some interesting things with the age categorization that are very, very important to what it's going to look like in the future and what publishing YA is going to look like in the future. So, if y'all want me to do the same thing that I did, because I know I reacted to a list where I was like, I'm going to react to the 100 books that everyone should read before they die, and then I went and shot my own 100 books that I think people should read before they die. If you want me to do the same thing, I can do the top 45 YA books that I think everyone should read, or every adult should read, or whatever, just the top 45 YA books of all time, in my opinion, my thoughts on what I think are the top. And you probably will see some of these as repeats, because there are some that are historically important and should be included on any list. But anyway, if you would like to see something like that, let me know in the comment box below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content from me, click the subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications. Looking for ways to support this channel, the links will be down in the description box below, social media down in the description box below, and I'll be back with another video soon.